Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome today, and welcome also to those of you who are joining us online. I'm Maria Fatsias, and I'm Chair of the Inner South Canberra Community Council, which is a peak body for Inner South residents groups. We welcome all candidates and guests. I know it's a very busy time for candidates, with only a week to go before early voting starts. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, their elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are participating in this forum with us today. We are live streaming this event and also hope to upload the record of the event to our website in the coming week. We've placed responses to our election priorities that have been provided by the candidates onto our website, which is www.isccc.org.au. And I think the Liberal Party provided theirs this morning. And so I don't know if they're all up there, but certainly whatever we had as of this morning has gone up there. We would also like to acknowledge and say that we're delighted to partner with Region Media to reach out to a broader audience in Canberra with our live stream. It's really fantastic, and we look forward to working with Genevieve this afternoon. We would also like to acknowledge the support of the Harmony German Club, which has provided this venue to us at no cost and also assisted with the sound system. Thanks to both Paul, the CEO, and Matthew, the Functions Manager. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Genevieve Jacobs, our host for the forum. Genevieve is Group Editor, Region Media Group. She has been a journalist for 30 years, working in print and radio. She's spent a decade with ABC Radio Canberra. She's co-chair of the ACT Reconciliation Council. She works also with a wide range of other Canberra organisations, including the Tara Costigan Foundation, Gift of Life ACT, and sits on the ACT's Advisory Committee for Historic Places and the boards of the National Folk Festival, Canberra International Musical Festival, M16 Art Space and the Conflict Resolution Service. We are very lucky to have her involvement today in hosting our forum, and I'll hand over to her now. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, both here at the Harmony German Club and at home watching us via Facebook Live, good afternoon and welcome to the Inner South Community Council's Politics in the Pub Style Election Forum. I'm really delighted that we at the Riot Act at Region Media have been able to partner with the Council to co-present this critically important forum. The seat of Kurrajong is a vital one in the upcoming ACT election. A couple of housekeeping details. This is a COVID-safe event. Those of you at home can participate by sending your questions in via the Riot Act's Facebook live stream. We'll be monitoring those continually and questions will be texted through to me. For those present, we have a standing microphone here in the middle of the room. But if you get up to speak, please do wait until the person before you has sat down before moving to the microphone, and we'll keep the microphone clean and sanitised between questions. You'll have a chance to ask questions throughout the debate, and we'll also leave a short time, if we possibly can, towards the end for questions that haven't been touched on yet. But we will never, ever get to everything. Such is the nature of these events. It's just impossible. This is, of course, an Inner South-focused event organised by the Inner South Community Council, so the majority of questions are focused tightly on issues that pertain to the Inner South. Time is tight today. I've briefed all the candidates to be concise. They're going to introduce themselves for only a minute, very shortly, and Anne over here to my left, to your right, is keeping time. And perhaps, or perhaps not, I might have a shepherd's crook to haul people off. She'll certainly ding the bell pretty hard when the minute comes along. We're going to look at 3 separate subject areas and spend 15 to 20 minutes on each one. These topics are drawn from the Council's online survey of Inner South residents. Now, this was conducted before the COVID lockdown and there were well over 500 respondents, and that's a terrific response to a community survey of any kind. In the context of the current planning review, the Council asked residents what they valued about where they live, what they would like to protect, and what to change to make it a better place to live. So we're going to discuss one of the election's key hot-button issues, that is, of course, the proposed Fyshwick waste facilities and the vision for Fyshwick, whether it continues its current evolution as a light industrial and bulk retail hub or becomes a more heavy industrial use suburb. Although I would say that the council survey results preceded the EIS for the CRS site. We'll also look at planning and development. We'll cover consultation, compliance, the enduring character of Canberra's suburbs, and we'll look at maintenance and renewal of key community amenities, including urban, forest and street trees, verges, open spaces, parks and reserves, footpaths and shared paths, and even street lighting. I'm going to ask each of the candidates to introduce themselves in a moment. The parties have agreed that they'll have a major spokesperson on stage up here on this level with me who will handle most of the questions, but they can defer to their fellow candidates, the bunnies down the front, if necessary. In the interest of getting through everything in a relatively short time, we are trying to make this as efficient as possible. So seated on the main stage and nominated as the main spokespersons for their party, Candice Birch for the Liberals, Shane Rattenbury for the Greens, Bruce Payne, Independent, Peter Swarbrick for the Canberra Progressives, Rachel Stephen-Smith for Labor and Alvin Hopper for Community Action. Seated on the stage below me, Rebecca Vassarotti for the Greens, Patrick Pentony for the Liberals, Elizabeth Lee for the Liberals, Tim Bohm for Canberra Progressives, and Peter Johnson for the Australian Climate Change Justice Party. Welcome to all of you. We'll also have some time at the beginning of this for a couple of questions from various community organisations that go towards making up the Inner South Community Council, but I'm going to start by asking each of the candidates to introduce themselves and to spend no more than 1 minute doing so. And Candice, you get to go first off. You're on.
Hello. Hi. Thank you all for coming out on this rainy Sunday afternoon, and thank you to Maria and your team for putting on this event. Shane and I were just chatting about how great it is to be here in real life and not just on Zoom, so it's great to see so many people here. My name is Candice Birch, and I am one of your Canberra Liberal MLAs, and I have been since the end of 2017, and I hold the shadow portfolios of transport and public sector management. Is that my minute?
That'll do you, Candice. Thank you for being so concise. Shane Rattenbury.
Well, thanks, Genevieve, and good afternoon, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be here. For the Greens, in the big picture, 2020 has shown us that we cannot continue with business as usual, and we do need to think really hard about issues like the climate crisis, growing inequality and housing affordability in our city. And we've got policies on all of those that are available on our website, and I can't possibly talk about in this time available. And locally, we've released some really interesting policies around a program for neighbourhood democracy, where we want each suburb to prioritise the maintenance needs in their suburb each year, as well as particular local policies around Kingston and Manuka shops being revitalised as lively centres, and also we'll have plenty to say during the discussion on particularly trees.
Okay, Bruce.
Hello. Hello, I'm Bruce Payne, Independent. I'll focus my opening remarks on rates and taxation. In 2018-19, Canberrans paid the highest state or territory taxation in Australia. Single people paid about $400 each year, more than the national rather, and households paid about $1,000 more than the national average. And these are based on data and facts from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Just imagine if that $1,000 all came off your rates bill. And using information from the current government's August 2020 budget update and other sources, that overtaxation is set to continue. I'll post the facts on the ACT budget on my Facebook page, Bruce Payne Independent, later today. If elected as Independent, my commitments include to making rates and taxes affordable, reviewing ACT government spending and just supporting a progressive community. And I'm happy to answer your questions.
Peter Swarbrick.
Thanks, Genevieve. Well, I'd just like to pay my respects to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose land we meet today, and just remind everybody that the sovereignty was never ceded. So I'm a local Canberran these days, moved here in 1999. I've lived in Narrabundah for all that time. I've loved watching my suburb grow. I've loved being the kind of slightly black sheep of the Inner South family. My children have all gone to public schools here. I have started my own business here. I absolutely love this part of Canberra, very passionate about the things that I see could be done better. So the Progressives are really about holding people to account. We're a new party. We're looking to offer cross-bench accountability, transparency, and we're not going to form government. We're not going to be surprising you all with mad new policies you've never heard of. What we are wanting to do is to be able to have an independent voice in the Legislative Assembly. The ACT is currently the only jurisdiction that does not have an independent voice in its decision-making.
That's it, you're done. Rachel Stephen-Smith.
Thanks, Genevieve. I also want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to thank the ISCCC for hosting today's forum and Region Media, and I particularly want to thank Maria, who's been an incredibly strong advocate for standing up for the Inner South and the voice for ISCCC over the last few years. Many of you in the room will know me. I'm Rachel Stephen-Smith. I was elected in 2016 to represent the heart of Canberra, the inner north and inner south in the electorate of Kurrajong. And I've spent a lot of time at mobile offices around the place over the last 4 years. Before that, I had a 20-year career in public policy, and it's been an absolute privilege to serve in a range of portfolios in the Barr Labor government, where I've seen the worst of people's lives and the best of our public service. And particularly this year, an incredibly difficult year, where our public service, not just our health officials have been amazing, but right across our public service, people have stood up, and the Canberra community has stood up and supported one another. So thank you for that.
Alvin Hopper.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I'm one of the 2 candidates in Kurrajong for the Community Action Party. I'm a retired lawyer with experience in both drafting and interpreting legislation, something that is sorely needed in the Legislative Assembly. Now, we in the Community Action Party, as our name implies, are strongly concerned to get proper and effective community involvement in government decisions. We are frankly sick and tired of the way decisions at the present are being taken behind closed doors with at best only nominal community consultation. 2 prime examples, I'm tempted to say worst examples, are the way the West Basin project is being pushed through, and more egregiously the decision by Minister Mick Gentleman to use his so-called call-in powers in Dixon to...
Alvin, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'd like to get the roving mic to Peter Johnson, please, on the bottom. Oops, feedback.
G'day, hi, great. Hey, good afternoon, thanks for being here. It's really nice to be here. I'm the convener of the Australian Climate Change Justice Party. We're a new party in the ACT. We're running 10 candidates and we've just announced them yesterday. I'll be sitting with Alex O'Hara in the seat of Kurrajong. Our primary objective is to, I think, do 3 things. First one is to share with Canberra a different version of sustainability than that advocated by the ACT Greens. We believe there's a more equitable, more prosperous and more thorough way to approach our city sustainability journey, and I think that pathway needs to be shared so that we have choice and opportunity to face the realities of this century. The second thing is we've got quite a detailed policy framework of how to achieve that, so I'm going to encourage you today, if you want to raise the problems and concerns that you have and you want to hear an alternative way of dealing with them, a different direction of dealing with them, which is more just, which is more sustainable, which is more cost effective, I'm going to encourage you to also ask me to answer some of your questions. And the third one is we're really concerned about the COVID situations.
Peter,
and
thank you very much.
we'll talk about that later. Thank you.
Look, I think we can wipe the microphone over very quickly first before we pass it on. Thank you. Tim Boehm.
Oh, it's not on. Oh, it is on. Okay, thank you, Genevieve and Maria and the ISCC for organising all this. I better speak quick because I've only got a minute. I could start by talking about myself, but really it's about you guys, it's about the community, it's about the electorate, more than just about me. But I can tell you about me is that I love the Inner South. I've spent half my life here. I went to Narrabundah College across the road there. My wife and myself own a commercial property and run a business from it in Fishweek. And my parents live in the Inner South. So I'm fully invested into the inner south, and that's part of the reason why I'm running. I can tell you what I've been picked up on the campaign trail is that a lot of people coming to me saying, I feel like I've been forgotten, I've been neglected, I've been not listened to, I've just been taken for granted, which is very disappointing, and which is one of the reasons why I'm running for the Canberra Progressives, so we can demand better. And we're going to get lots of questions about planning, and the major parties today are going to promise the world here today, right? So take everything with a grain of salt because you won't see them again for 4 years.
Okay, we'll just get a new microphone to Elizabeth Lee. I'm sorry, COVID safety is just such a pain, but we're trying to do this one the right way. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Lee, and it's been a great privilege and a pleasure to serve you as your local member for the last 4 years, and I hope that I am returned this election to continue to do so. I'm also wear different hats in the Assembly, so Shadow Minister for Education, Disability and the Environment and Assistant Speaker, but of course my primary role is as the member for Kurrajong. The Canberra Liberals are committed to ensuring that we make Canberra the best place to live, work and raise a family, and we want to make sure that we reduce the cost of living pressures for all Canberrans and create a sustainable Canberra for everyone. Thank you. And huge thank you to Genevieve, of course, and Maria as well for putting this on.
Okay, Patrick Pentony.
Good afternoon. I will just talk about myself. I was born a third-generation Canberran. I went to school in the inner south. I went to university at the University of Canberra where I studied landscape architecture. After that, I was a certified organic farmer before becoming a businessman, opening 2 shops and the Southside Farmers Market. I currently raise my family in the south. I live in Griffith, and my children go to Red Hill School, where I'm the immediate past president of the P&C there. I love the inner south. I always wanted to live in the inner south. I know it's the best part of Canberra. I unfortunately feel we pay the most in rates and get the least for it. We're the last to get the green bin. We were the last to get bulky goods collection. Our paths are the worst. Having walked over 1,000 kilometres letterboxing in the inner south, I can tell you we have the worst footpaths for the money we pay in rates. Thank you.
Okay, and to Rebecca Vassarotti.
Thank you, everyone. And I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay respects to elders past, present and future. It's a real delight to be here, and I just feel really privileged that we get the opportunity to be here with you, and thank you to the council for organising this. I'm a born and bred Canberran. I have lived in the electorate for 20 years. I do live on the north side of town, but spend plenty of time in the south. And as a mum, as someone who's worked and lived and played in this city for 20 years, I think this is a fantastic place to live. What has motivated me over the last 20 years of my professional life is working in the community and health services sector to make sure that this is a fantastic city for everybody, including those that are really struggling and doing it tough. And so I'm really excited to be part of the Greens team that really is focused on making sure that this city works for our people, that we invest in our environment, and we really look to the future in terms of how we do create a better normal.
Thanks everyone for being so concise. I'd like to also acknowledge that Robin Williams is in the room from Community Action, not speaking today but with us from the front row, and a number of apologies from other Kurrajong candidates, including Therese Faulkner from the Canberra Progressives, Maddie Northam from Labor, Jacob Ingram from Labor and Judy Anderson from Labor. We're now going to go to several questions that have been prepared in advance by a number of community organisations. The first comes from Barbara Moore from the Kingston and Barton Residents Group. If you'd go to the microphone.
My question is to the representatives of Kurrajong, Labor's Rachel Stephen-Smith and Liberals Candice Birch. Could both Labor and Liberal candidates indicate if in government you would support the call by the ACT Greens and the Canberra Progressives for a moratorium on any new waste technologies or proposals being improved?
Okay, Rachel Stephen-Smith, to you first.
You might be aware that the ACT government has already put a moratorium on waste to energy in the ACT through the Waste to Energy Policy 2020 to 2025. And following consultation with the community about waste to energy, we moved to ban waste incineration in the ACT, stopping the burning of rubbish. in order to encourage higher order forms of recycling. So absolutely, and you'll also be aware that Chris Steele has recently reiterated and confirmed Labor's position in relation to the CRS facility in particular, that a Labor government would not support red bin waste going to that facility, which is exactly what it relies on for its business case, and that Labor's clear position is that resource recovery facilities should be co-located in Hume as per the ACT's waste management strategy.
I'll have some more questions for you on that in a moment, Rachel, but Candice, to you. Moratorium?
Yes, the Canberra Liberals do also support a moratorium on waste or recycling facilities in Fyshwick prior to the development of a master plan for Fyshwick.
Okay, David Denham from the Griffith Narrabundah Community Association.
Okay, I'd like to ask each of the main parties, let us suppose that you are back in government, all three of you. What would be the first bit of legislation, high priority action that you would introduce into the Assembly? In other words, you're there. What is the top priority for you to get stuck into the legislation and make us all a better place?
David, I'd like to actually direct you to the question I've got in front of me, which is about clean and unpolluted air for a healthy living environment. I think you've asked the biggest question for an election forum candidate that I've ever heard from anyone. So could I direct you to the question you've actually submitted, please?
Well, I thought you were going to read that out to me, but never mind.
No, I can read it out if you'd like to sit down.
Yeah,
I can
why
read it out.
don't you do that?
Great. Okay, let's go ahead with that then. Clean, unpolluted air is critical for a healthy living environment. We have to cope with bushfires, wood smoke, diesel fumes, pollen and tyre particles. The current network contains only 3 permanent air monitoring stations in Florey, Civic and Monash. We don't even have one in Fyshwick where we really need one. So the question is, will the candidates commit to installing a new air monitoring station in Fyshwick and consider another 2 in Gungahlin and Western Creek? I won't go to those because, of course, they're nowhere within cooey of the inner south. But Shane Rattenbury, to you first, air monitoring stations. Would you make a commitment?
Yes, we will. We actually saw the impact on air pollution very strongly in our city earlier in the year, and I moved a motion in February in the Assembly to bring new air monitoring stations and develop an air pollution strategy. That's been supported and that work's now underway, and we do support further efforts in that space. Okay, Rachel Stephen-Smith.
Yes, and I've just written back to the Griffith Narrabundah Community Association very belatedly today in relation to this matter. But yes, absolutely, we will explore that, not necessarily the NEPM stations that we currently have that monitor not only air quality in terms of PM 2.5 and PM 10, but they monitor a whole range of other pollutants, but we'd certainly look at absolutely expanding the air quality monitoring system for those kinds of pollutants that David is talking about. And as Shane said, we are committed to the development of an air quality strategy. Unfortunately, the people in charge of that are the Chief Health Officer and her team, who have been slightly distracted since we moved that motion in the Assembly this year.
Okay, Candice Birch.
Yes, the Canberra Liberals have also committed to an air monitoring station in Fyshwick, and as you say, air quality has been something at the top of people's minds over the last 8 or so months, so we would be open to investigating whether further air quality stations are needed.
And look, I should make clear that these questions have been directed to the sitting members, so or representatives from each of the parties that's in the Assembly at the moment. So minor parties and other candidates will have a chance to comment as we go through the debate. But I'd like to now call on Gary Petherbridge from the Owners Corporation Network. Gary.
Yes, with relevance to the inner south, in view of the fact that Kingston Barton has 85% of its apartments or housing units are apartments, so it's relevant. But the rates, both parties have announced a rates freeze. This is the Liberals and the Labor and Greens together. But so I'll direct my question to Candice and Shane, and I think in this sense Shane is probably representing the Treasurer who's absent. But anyway, we didn't notice that he got an apology from him either. But the key thing here is not so much the freeze, but it is what do you do while the freeze is on. There was a promised review for the rates and the way they were calculated. What is each party's attitude to that review? I think the 12 months or the 4 years gives plenty of time to actually get it right. So I want to know what the attitude is to the actual review, not the rates themselves, but the review.
Shane.
Yeah, certainly, Gary. There was information brought out just before the end of the Assembly. The Treasurer tabled a series of reports that have been done. They're all publicly available. I'm sure you've seen them. Others might like to read them, and they show that the tax reform overall has been progressive. It has made the situation more equitable. We think there are still areas that need to be worked on, particularly when it comes to the distribution of rates across the units and how that's been calculated. We have seen, we think, some unexpected outcomes from the way that's been set up, and so that's the area we're particularly focused on. And also making sure that people who are on fixed income, they're being considered in the process as well.
Candice?
Yes, so the Canberra Liberals have committed to a 4-year rates freeze. So from day one, we will freeze your rates for 4 years. I just want to point out that the freeze the government has announced is only for 1 year, and there are a large number of suburbs in Kurrajong that won't apply to. In terms of apartment rates, we do agree that the changes to apartment rates have been unfair, particularly for people on fixed incomes. So that's something we will definitely continue to work to address.
Okay, let's move now to the 3 major discussion topics, and we'll open up to questions from the floor and also questions that are submitted via the Rideacts Facebook live feed. And we're going to start with one of the election's key hot button issues, and that is, of course, the proposed Fyshwick waste facilities and that vision for the future of Fyshwick. And the Inner South Community Council believes that this is a critical juncture for competing visions of Fyshwick. One as a light industrial zone close to fairly dense urban residential development, that huge development that's taking place on Dairy Road. And the other vision, of course, is a significantly heavier industrial pivot. Now, there are, as you all know, 3 separate proposals here. The environmental impact statement for the CRS waste facility in Ipswich Street has been approved. An EIS has been submitted for the larger high-quality waste facility in Tennant Street in Fyshwick. And there is also the current DA assessment for the metal fragmentiser for access recycling in Lithgow Street, not mentioning, of course, the approved rail freight terminal that will also be there. I'm going to ask a question of each of the parties represented up here on the stage, but if you would like to ask a question, you can move to the microphone at your leisure. Rachel Stephen-Smith, I want to start with you. Now, you've been asked about a moratorium a moment ago, and you predicated your answer on waste to energy and incineration. I want to know where the government finally conclusively stands on the question of heavy industrial waste processing in Fyshwick. It's not entirely apparent in the Labor response to the council a direct answer as to whether you will rule out heavy industrial waste processing.
Labor's position is that we support resource recovery facilities being co-located in Hume, not in Fyshwick. The challenge I think we have, and Minister Gentleman made it clear in approving the EIS that this was not, or releasing the EIS, this was not an approval for the project itself. And that process identified a number of issues that the proponent for the CRS facility would have to address if they were going to progress through the development application. I think what this whole process indicates is, and I totally understand the community's frustration with this. There are rules that public servants are bound to follow. There are legislative processes that they cannot override. They can't either reject or rubber stamp things, which came up in a forum the other day. And this requires a lot of input from the community. When people put forward proposals that are currently allowed in the zoning, they cannot be rejected outright, and the community ends up putting in a lot of effort for something that probably won't be viable in the first place because it relies on a decision of government that we are not going to make. We were never going to make that decision to provide red bin waste to that facility, and yet the proponents keep pushing it forward. So I do think there's more work to do in relation to Fyshwick. I can't make a commitment in terms of changing zoning today here, but Labor's position is very clear that we believe that these kinds of facilities should be co-located in Hume, not in Fyshwick.
Okay, so that's not a direct commitment to say no to this, it's a wait and see?
Genevieve, there are legislative processes where people are currently entitled to make an application, and those applications have to be considered by an independent authority. I, as Minister, Mick Gentleman as Minister, the Chief Minister, don't actually have the authority to intervene in those processes.
Okay, Shane Rattenbury, to you. Would the Greens commit to a waste management policy that rules out Fishwick, that recognises that anywhere so close to dense urban development isn't suitable for mass waste management? The Greens' response talks about needing to reconcile community values and asking for a moratorium, but again, not ruling this out conclusively.
Yeah, Genevieve, we call for a moratorium because we think there's some really complex issues here to be worked on, and what we don't want to see is things being approved because it's impossible to unpick them later. We are trying to understand why all of a sudden all these proposals are coming forward in Fishwick and what the drivers for that are, why people want to bring waste from New South Wales to the ACT. We think there's probably issues there with the ACT's waste levies. We think Fishwick is changing and that therefore there needs to be a re-examination of the industrial zoning. But I do echo Rachel's point. At the moment, the rules allow for certain things and certain processes are underway, which is why we want to put a stop on the clock while we actually work out what... It's only fair that the rules are really clear for proponents as well.
We're certainly in the midst of a planning review. What about a zoning review as a significant part of that post-election? Is that something you'd agitate for?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Candice Birch, what about the Liberals? Where do you stand on issues like importing waste into the ACT? I mean, is this simply an industrial diversification opportunity? Is it something that the Liberals think could be manageable at Fishwick?
This is, as you have said, and as I think everyone has said, Fishwick is clearly changing, and that is why we do support a master plan for Fishwick so that residents and businesses can have their say in what the future of Fishwick is, and I think that is really important that the community is properly consulted in what the future of Fishwick is. We don't think that the location is appropriate for these kinds of developments, and we would rather see, we want to make Hume an employment hub with the infrastructure and the traffic management that is required around that. So invest in Hume as an employment hub that could have world-class recycling and waste facilities.
Okay. Peter Johnson, I want to go to you down there in the front from the Climate Change Justice Party. If we end up with some or any of these approvals from 3 different proposals going through, do you see a way to manage the impact on air quality and other pollution risks in Fishwick or indeed in Hume?
Look, for us, it's a no-brainer. You know, everyone has said, yeah, we'll think about it and we'll rezone it. It's really a no-brainer. We're growing a closed-loop economy in the ACT. The waste streams are a very important economic and industrial resource, and we need to set aside the right infrastructure and land away from the communities to be innovative, to be able to maximise the value of our waste resource. So for us, it's a no-brainer. If we have the balance of power, one of the negotiation things is going to be very clearly, these sort of proposals don't belong in Fishwick. These proposals belong in Hume, and we need to set up an industrial estate appropriate for sustainable industries there near our waste streams. In terms of air quality monitoring, absolutely. We do want to increase the quality of standards of air quality in the ACT. We do have cars that create a lot of air emissions. We have some industry that's got that potential, and we may be investing in sustainable industries that have new innovative manufacturing techniques which could result in air quality standards. We are very concerned about environmental quality standards. Right there in Fishwick, we have the Canter facility on top of the headwaters of our lake. All the nutrient flow and the environmental eutrophication that come from that facility poison our lake. Yet, I've asked for environmental standards from the ACT government, no response over the course of 2 years. You know, it's a joke. There's a new version of dealing with these sort of issues, and it doesn't include paperwork and bureaucrats that can't do anything. It requires leadership. Thank you.
Peter Swarbrick, Progressives support a moratorium on these developments. It looks like there's a fair degree of agreement that a moratorium might be a way forward when there's growing community tension and opposition. Is there a risk, though, that opponents are being too precious by half? I mean, the economic reality is that we've got all too little of the manufacturing that provides a more secure revenue base in the ACT. That is a perennial problem for the ACT's finances. Don't we need to find a way to do these things safely?
Well, look, as a business person, you know, certainty. But then also as a resident, I'm thinking about the waterways, I'm thinking about the air quality. You know, Fishwick basically has become something that, you know, people obviously couldn't have imagined 30 or 40 years ago, and it goes back to this where you begin. The problem for the proponents is that they're being asked to put in submissions that just don't have enough around them already to stop them in their tracks if they are going to be polluting or create traffic hazards. So to a certain extent, you know, I was on a forum the other night where we heard the government, Rachel Stephen-Smith, talking about, you know, the proponents needing to do that community engagement better. Well, clearly they're not. They're not asking that information. They're not collecting it on a whole bunch of levels here: environmental, residential, you know, all of these impacts on 600 metres away, people in Narrabundah would be close to this development. And I get it, but Hume was there. So clearly there was some cheap land or some other thing driving them to purposefully go and make a proposal in a really not fit for purpose area. And that is government legislation. That's the responsibility, is to get those frameworks right so you don't attract the wrong proponents.
Look, I think it's certainly fascinating, isn't it, that we've got 3 of these different proposals which all appear to be co-locating and occurring at the same time. Bruce Payne, what about you? We hear a lot about NIMBYism in this town. Let me be perhaps a little brutal and say that nobody could say Fish Week had a lot of charm to start with. But you've had a long career in Treasury. Do we need to put these facilities in place to broaden our revenue base, to diversify our fairly light industrial base and continue growing the economic pie?
Look, I'm on the record as basically supporting the ISCCC's position on this. So that's one point I'd make. The second point, someone mentioned consultation. In so many areas, the Labor and Greens have allowed the proponent of projects to do the consultation. I just think that's fundamentally wrong. It's like allowing a developer to hire the certifier. Ridiculous. So public servants should be doing... Public servants should be doing the consultation so that the Assembly, not just necessarily the government, hears what it's about. Look, in terms of, I have a fair bit of sympathy for what Peter's saying. I think we should get it well away from the residential area. And I do note that there is a disused rail line essentially from Fishwick down to Hume now. I don't think it's beyond the capability of woman and man to reinstate that and have a good transport route down there.
Alvin Hooper, to you, reading Community Action's policies on managing these issues, you've got some interesting strategies. You suggest presenting all environmental impact statements and DA exemptions to the Assembly for approval, and a reinstated Planning and Land Council to which the ministerial call-in powers would be accountable. How might that perhaps apply in these circumstances?
I don't claim to be an expert on waste disposal. I'll make the obvious comment that it's something that affects the health of us all. I'd like to come back to the point I made in my opening address, and that is the need for wide and effective consultation. This is obviously a very difficult issue. I have here in my hand the Inner South's concerns on the matter. I'll just read out the headings. Impact on water quality in the Molonglo River, wetlands and Lake Burley Griffin. Sorry, I'm just trying to turn the page. Impact on air quality, traffic impacts, and perhaps most alarmingly, storage of toxic and flammable materials. Now, what we in Community Action Party want to see in this sort of situation, among others, is effective consultation aided by proper professional investigation and report. It's a matter that vitally affects the community. I don't know whether that answers your question. Possibly it does not, but it expresses the view of myself and my party on this sort of matter.
Thanks, Alvin. Look, we do have perhaps a few minutes for a question or two. I know this is one of the big hot-button issues for the electorate as a whole, for Kurrajong and for development in the Inner South. If you've got a question, could you step up to the microphone, please? And just let me know who you'd like to address your question to.
Colin Walters, Griffith, Narrabundah Community Association. This debate shouldn't be about Fyshwick, it should be about Mugger Lane. We've got a facility now which is an environmental disaster. Keeping it going for a few more years involves ripping up an area 1.5 times the size of Tilapia Park, an area of native woodland. It's also a huge fire risk surrounded by dry woodland, which if it caught fire would quickly spread to the suburbs. It's only 5 miles from Red Hill. It's completely unsustainable. It's full of all sorts of combustible material which had been piled up there for decades. The debate should be about what we do about Mugger Lane, and it should be taken fairly urgently, moratorium or no moratorium. So my question is, given that the major parties have ruled out Fyshwick, and that seems to be a no-go for many years to come, what are we going to do about the Mugger Lane problem, and what other alternatives should be looked at, given that Hume is also only 4 kilometres from a residential area?
Shane Rattenbury, is Mugger Lane on your radar as needing urgent attention?
Well, I think what the question goes to is actually the issue of how we produce products and the waste we generate. As a society, we consume resources at a rate of knots and produce a huge amount of waste. The China sword policy, which has stopped Australia simply shipping its waste overseas, is a real opportunity for us to refocus on both building recycling industries in this country, so that we're not having to create a big landfill at Mugger Lane, but also creating jobs. There's far more jobs in recycling industries than there is in burning waste or just dumping it in a pile in the tip.
Rachel Stephen-Smith, is the government actively looking at Mugger Lane and the management there?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the starting point is the same as Shane. We actually need to reduce the amount of waste that's going into the tip at Mugger Lane, and that's why ACT Labor has committed to food organics going into green bins. If we're re-elected, that'll be part of the green bin policy, food organics going into those to get that 30% of waste into our red bins at the moment is food organics, getting that out of the waste stream to reduce the need for landfill in Mugger Lane. We've also made significant investments in the materials recycling facility in Hume in partnership with the Commonwealth Government, and we've seen some real innovation in the way that some of those materials that weren't previously able to be used, or where we've had challenges sending them elsewhere, are used. Things like glass and toner cartridges being used in road base. I think what we'll see in response to the lack of capacity to export our waste is some real innovation in how we use those things, but that does have to be done fast.
Okay, Candice, I'll give you a chance to respond on that too. Mugger Lane?
Yeah, so I know my colleagues in Tuggeranong have also been fighting the tip smell for a number of years. That has been a significant issue for Tuggeranong residents down there. So it is something that is on our radar, and it is something that needs to be addressed. As Shane and Rachel have said, we do need to look at reducing our waste, but we do also need to look at new and emerging technologies and better ways for managing it.
George makes the comment on the stream, Mugger Lane is native woodland. It should be restored and revegetated. We'll also go on to consultation now. Some questions coming in around that and planning. So if we have further questions on Fyshwick, we might leave those perhaps until we get to the end if there are things we haven't answered yet. I'm just going to try to manage the time if we can. I want to go now to planning and development, and this centres around community consultation and ensuring the best development outcome. Not an easy matter at the best of times. And one, of course, exemplified by several memorable stoushes in this neck of the woods, including the likes of the Manuka Oval redevelopment plan. We'll touch on compliance too, and there is, of course, a call from the community councils as a whole for a new territory plan to deal with deep-seated concerns about how planning proceeds. Shane Rattenbury, I want to start with you. This is one of those massive Canberra perennials, the satisfaction or otherwise with the planning process. It seems to me that that's very much about trust, and that to a certain extent the government to whom you lend your support in the coalition between the two of you has lost the trust of the people in the planning process. What needs to happen to rebuild that between the community, the developers and the government, and what sort of muscles would the Greens wield to make sure that that actually happens?
Well, Genevieve, we've just released a detailed planning policy in the past week. It's 9 pages, so I won't get into all of it now, but it's available on our website. It's actually about going back to some basics, things like building quality. It is about going back to having government certifiers rather than private certifiers. There is a clear conflict of interest there that we need to shift that balance on. Clearly, the issues of consultation are ones that ring very solidly, and we're keen to see more deliberative democracy used in the ACT, those processes where people really get to sit in a room and work on the details and really have an informed discussion in a way that is far more engaging than simply a developer turning up. I think the other problem we have, and this goes to the geocon development proposal in Kingston, is where developers simply try it on. You know, the Kingston height limit is 4 stories, and we've seen a proponent come forward with an 8-story proposal. That breaches trust in the most fundamental ways that I think are really problematic.
The community consultation is often carried out by developers.
Indeed.
Why is that the case?
Well, that's the way the planning rules are set up at the moment, and we are looking to find better ways to go about that because, and my colleague Caroline just had a bill in the Assembly trying to improve some of those processes recently. Interestingly, from where we sit, we lost a lot of those votes 23-2 in the Assembly. That's the challenge for small parties, is that often Labor and Liberal combine to defeat these propositions.
On that, Alvin Hopper, I just wonder if you could talk to me about the Minor Parties Pact and its possible effect on community representation and therefore perhaps paying more heed to consultative processes. What's the Minor Parties Pact and what would you promise to do?
I think this raises the whole question of planning. I think the present government's record is deplorable. I don't see how the Greens can claim in Canberra to be the party that protects the environment. I've also already mentioned the arbitrary action that's proposed to be taken as regards West Basin, with further concerns at the eastern end of the lake. There's also the question of infilling. One example is in Chapman, where housing was put on an open green space. Just digressing for a minute, I grew up in a suburban area where we were blessed with 2 parks, a fair-sized one in the suburban area and a large central park in the town centre. They were essential as lungs for recreation and fresh air and breathing. We're desperately in need of that sort of thing in Canberra, but what is the government doing? It's doing its best to infill and build houses along, or apartments along the lake, and goodness knows what else, including Mick Gentleman's coup d'etat with the Common Land and his minister's call-in Dixon, totally arbitrary. And where is our environment going? The Greens might claim that greater density protects the environment. But that's not the case. There was a study, a widely accredited study, I may add, in 2007 by the University of Victoria, published in Architecture Review, and it's been widely quoted and credited, which completely undermines the suggestion that infilling and density increases or protects the environment. It does nothing of the sort. To say nothing of all the social problems that are involved. What I'm saying is that we need community involvement to help protect our environment.
Alvin, thank you. Peter Swarbrick, I want to go to you next. One of the problems about planning is that a surprising amount of the planning decision process is actually quite subjective. In DA-exempt knockdowns, for example, you could effectively change the whole character of the street without needing to consult anyone much. We look at the issues around the geocon plans for the multi-storey apartment block in Kingston. Should there be some simple rules for key parameters around things like height, setbacks, appropriate solar access, number of dwellings on the block and permeable and planting areas?
Look, I can understand the impetus. If you have a look, ACT, we don't have councils. We are actually dealing with a state government on a whole bunch of local community issues that other places would have a council member to go to. So I can certainly see, what's the thinking behind, these sort of unsolicited proposals, people being asked to be innovative and put something fantastic to the government. They do all the work. But of course the problem there is that proposal is being driven by a vested interest, and generally that vested interest is profit. So we seem to have a shrinking of the government's involvement in the actual service part, the public service part. Shane referred just briefly to certifiers. When you outsource things that need to be very objective and absolutely community-based, community interest first, you're going to get these kind of conflicts of interest. So I definitely think that maybe we've gone too far. I understand, you know, everyone's always asking for less red tape, less confusion, less government involvement, but in the ACT we have a very specific sort of set of circumstances, and we have to be a bit cleverer about creating those frameworks that do encourage the speedy approval of things, but don't encourage really poor sort of proposals and things that people have to get up and fight over for months and months and months to get changed.
And lots of comments coming in online about urban infill and whether urban infill is indeed environmentally sustainable and protective of the environment. But Candice Birch, I want to go to you. The Inner South has among the lowest proportion of detached dwellings in any Canberra district and among the highest proportions of high-density development. Would a Liberal government agree to mandatory community engagement and consultation before further zoning changes are made?
I think that there is... I think there is also a lack of medium density, which we have heard from the community is something that more people do want to see. So that's something that we do need to look at. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So would you agree to mandatory community engagement consultation before further zoning changes are made? So before we wholesale say that we are going to change the nature and character and identity of the area, must there be community consultation?
Absolutely, we need to see more community consultation. We need to see genuine community consultation. I know a lot of people feel like consultation at the moment is too often just a box-ticking exercise for the government, and it doesn't seem to be genuine, and I think that goes not just through planning but a whole heap of different areas where people feel it's a foregone conclusion and it is just a box-ticking exercise. So particularly when it comes to planning, we need to ensure that the existing character of our suburbs is being maintained and that the existing community is being valued. At the end of the day, any new development should be contributing to the existing community because that is the community that has already built and invested in that area, and we want to see that enhanced and that be valued.
Bruce Payne, one of the questions here, of course, is that revenue can be leveraged off sites in the Inner South to a fairly substantial degree. What value do you think that perhaps a whole new territory plan could deliver, and what would its foundations need to be?
Look, I think it's imperative that we develop a whole new territory sort of master plan that gives certainty to residents and business and people proponents. I think the Assembly has a key role in setting the high-level parameters of that. That is the ultimate community consultation. Doesn't mean the Assembly should or could decide every detail. And it's certain, and then as that cascades down, there certainly needs to be binding parameters. The key parameters need to be absolutely binding. Look, frankly, I don't think we'll see any change while Labor and Greens have a majority, and Labor's too close to the whole construction industry and Greens are wedded to Labor. I think we need some independence in there to, move on.
And I have another question from online saying, why can't we go back to the Garden City concept rather than no room for yards or gardens? Rachel Stephen-Smith, if we take that next step down from a whole new territory plan, what about a master plan for Manuka to the lake? Now that was a 2016 commitment. Surely that would calm the apprehensions that it is developers who are calling the shots, and particularly in this area which is rich with some of Canberra's most significant built heritage, and where there is concern that the conservation management plans are not robust enough in their effect.
Thanks, Genevieve. This obviously was a commitment and a discussion in the last election, and there has been a community panel in the context of the planning review, and I recognise that people considered that there were differences of view about how that went. But it has sort of been caught up in the planning review, which has taken a bit longer than we intended. But the planning review, I think, is really critical. We have heard very clearly from people that they want more simplicity, they want more transparency, they want more district-level planning, and they want a system that will deliver outcomes that make sense for the neighbourhood. And what we have at the moment is a very rules-based system where people can tick all the boxes and still deliver an outcome that doesn't make sense for that neighbourhood. But that is not an easy thing to do. It is not easy to have a system that is both simple and has enough rules in it, and I know the ISCCC has sort of both these things in its proposal to deliver the right outcome. So that's why there's already been a lot of consultation in relation to the planning review. Just on master plans as part of that, I think, Shane mentioned that for the Kingston development, the rule is 4 stories. The rule is actually 2 stories with the capacity to go higher if you're not overshadowing and if you fit in with the neighbourhood. But people think it's 4 stories because it was 4 stories in the master plan. And I think this just points to the complexity of the system that we've got at the moment and the whole reason why we're doing the planning review, because there are too many different parts of the system and they move around, and then people, whether they're proponents or whether they are the community, don't actually know which part of the system which part of the document they're supposed to be looking at to get the right information.
Just staying with you for a moment there, Rachel, on the question of heritage and the heritage values of the Inner South, we still don't have that heritage listing for the Canberra National Capital Values. Now, that's something that dates back to the centenary. Still no robust framework for protecting arguably the very reason for us all being here in the first place.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important question, particularly for the Inner South, but for the older parts of Canberra more broadly. And we do have more work to do on our heritage. I can't speak specifically to the Canberra plan from 2013 and why that hasn't progressed the way that people were expecting. But I'm certainly very conscious of some of the feedback that I've had from people in Kingston as well as from people in Reid about the protection of our heritage areas. And one of the things we've been talking about in relation to the development of the whole East Lake area is how do we recognise and celebrate that heritage? How do we acknowledge it? How do we mark it? And how do we tell the story of what this part of Canberra was and how it helped to build Canberra as the national capital, while also telling the story of what this whole area was before European colonisation.
Just on this issue of planning, I want to go for a moment to transport, and actually, Peter Johnson, I want to go to you on transport and priorities, because that's clearly a part of what we're discussing in making a functional, well-planned city. Would you seek to make the Inner South more transport accessible? How would your priorities be articulated?
Look, the big white elephant in the room is the Sydney to Woden tram at $2 billion, made by interstate builders, interstate materials and interstate labour, and in the midst of our COVID recovery. So my basic answer is to say we're absolutely opposed to pouring $2 billion to interstate companies right now in the midst of COVID recovery dealing with transport. We see opportunities with the electrification of cars, we see opportunities with electrification of our buses, the improvement of our buses, and just waiting another 3-4 years with our existing technology but much more improved routes to get us ready for the technology of autonomy buses and electrification of our buses. That's one question. I did want to raise something that I didn't think was represented well to the audience about the minor parties and the Minor Party Pact, if I may.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Look, effectively, the minor parties have looked at what's happened with Labor and Greens and the ACT, how far they are really from the community's concerns, the community's need. And together as minor parties, we've said, look, enough is enough. We're going to recommend to the Canberra electorate that people vote for the minor parties. They vote for all the minor parties before they cast their vote with the majors. When it's not working and it's not working, it's time to stand up. We're in the middle of COVID. They've already had $25 billion to spend, and they've turned up tonight saying, oh, we're just about to do that, or we now have a new proposal to do that, and a new proposal to do that. Well, guys, we've had 2 terms and you've blown $50 billion during those 2 terms of our ratepayers' money. So the minor parties are furious, and that's the request we're placing to the electorate. So I think I covered off those 2 factors. On a planning perspective, we basically see the planning is a Sydney centrification that's being pushed upon the community in the ACT. Everyone knows it. A lot of people are outraged. The quality of our lives in suburbia is under serious risk this next term. We better watch out because they're pouring apartments and Sydney developers all over the city. The basic principle is this. You as a community give our government the money for them to do what you want. They haven't done that, and now you're in a situation where you're fighting with your government for the planning and positions they're making. We think that's outrageous. That's not how to take our community forward from a sustainable development perspective. Thank you.
Okay. Look, I've got a couple more questions to ask centring around transport and access. But if you do want to move to the microphone and you've got a question about this broader theme of planning, development and more consultation, please do so. But Candice Birch, I want to go back to you on transport and whether the Liberals would offer an integrated land use and transport policy for all these areas, if we think Civic to Woden, down to perhaps the junction of Yarra Glen and the Cotter Road and Adelaide Avenue, and then coming back in this direction, Queanbeyan and Fishwick to Civic, and of course Monica is a part of that. Could you articulate a vision for how all that might work better that includes everything, that's cars, light rail and buses?
Yes, so we definitely do need integrated and longer term planning when it comes to transport, and as we've seen with the government and light rail at the moment, they're not being particularly transparent with Canberrans about those future plans. The inner south as well have lost out recently with changes to buses, and Narrabundah in particular have lost out with the last few changes to the bus network, and that is something that we are continuously fighting to address, yeah.
Okay, let's go to a question from the floor.
Good afternoon, candidates. My name's Abby. I'm a resident of Kingston. As has been hit on this afternoon, urban planning is obviously a key focus in this election. However, given the fact that the building and construction industry is one of the large ones in the ACT, how can, and I suppose it's more directed at Labor, Liberal and Greens, how can you guys ensure that we actually won't be in the same position in 4 years' time? How can you ensure that you will actually enact urban planning legislation that will address these issues and also put in place effective penalties to punish those corporations that go against the previous agreements or what they've said in their contracts?
And Rachel Stephen-Smith, I'll go to you first on this one. I mean, there's a certain sense of déjà vu for those of us who've been around for a while on these issues, that we go from election to election and the same knotty, thorny, admittedly really difficult problems come up. But it's a fair point, isn't it? How do we not end up in 2024 with us all sitting on the same stage having the same arguments?
So I think some of the things that we've already done, introducing mandatory pre-DA consultation, in establishing the National Capital Design Review Panel, which developers have to go to if they're developing above a certain size of development. Those things are already making a difference and providing some more transparency for the community and something that you can really look at to say, actually, that's what the experts told you needed to do to improve this project. Why haven't you done it in the case of the National Capital Design Review Panel? But I think the question also went to build quality, and it is absolutely accepted, I think, by everyone that there has been too much trust in developers and builders to do the right thing when it came to building quality developments in our city, and they haven't lived up to the trust that was placed in them. And that's why we've established quite a number of reforms over the last couple of years in relation to build quality. I'll very quickly list a few things because I know I've got short on time, but improving documentation at the building approval stage, implementing more relevant inspection and audit processes, and Shane mentioned bringing compliance auditors, I've lost the word, Shane, back in-house certifiers, in-house, and we're going to be doing that for larger developments as well. Improving licensing requirements for builders and building surveyors, providing better information for consumers and practitioners, and establishing stronger and more detailed standards of practicing and contracting, and developing a new scheme for resolving building disputes. We're also proposing the establishment of a developer licensing scheme, something I understand the Canberra Liberals are still opposing, but something that we think is really important to hold developers to account and to provide transparency for consumers about who it is they're partnering with when they're making one of the most important investments they will ever make.
Candice Birch, let me go to you on that. That's a pretty interesting concession from Rachel Stephen-Smith that there is disappointment with the behaviour of some developers. Why would you oppose the notion that she's just positioned there?
Yeah, we had reasons for opposing that. However, we do think that we need to increase enforcement, which, as the question originally went to, increase enforcement and also increase transparency so that people, there is greater transparency so that people can be aware of these issues and so that these issues don't happen.
What are your reasons for opposing it, if I can just push you on that?
I'm sorry, I can't recall the details of the bill and the amendments that Rachel is referring to.
Okay, that's fine. Shane Rattenbury, what's your response?
I think government's fundamental role is to step in where there's market failure, and that's what we're seeing in the industry over the last couple of decades. The rules have been pushed way too far into a laissez-faire approach. That's why we've put forward this issue of going back to government certifiers. We want to change the legislation around the release of government sites in the ACT so that instead of the agencies being required to accept the sale to the highest bidder, we actually accept the sale to the best project, which may see government revenue fall to some extent, but that's the only way we're going to get better outcomes, so that we can insist on buildings that are better quality, that have better environmental standards. We are building buildings here at the moment where, as Canberra gets hotter, which it will under climate change scenarios, they're simply totally reliant on air conditioning. They're not well designed, they're not sustainable, and we need to lift the standard so that people get to live in buildings that are comfortable and actually have lower running costs over time to help keep the cost of living down.
Now, there is some scepticism among those listening online on the licensing scheme. Another comment saying, it seems to me that there's a middle road to be struck with urban infill and densification. Set a minimum amount, a percentage of open space per square kilometre, so not on individual developments but per square kilometre, and limit building heights outside of town centres to say 4 or 5 storeys, and then only in the areas zoned for medium density. Many of those things are within the parameters that are already set. But the comment here is those 4 to 5 storey terrace houses throughout Western Europe seem like a nice human-scaled solution for medium density. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you, Jen. Kevin Gill. I don't think I belong. I think I belong to 3 or 4 of the groups. So, everybody knows in the inner south that other people outside the inner south think inner south's well equipped, well organised. Leave them alone. Just charge them what they can, and that's that. But the fact is, we know that's not the truth. And I think there's some glaring projects, or big projects, that need to be done in the inner south, and I want to hear from the candidates what they think. The first thing is, I think the old inner south needs a high school. One of the new walk-in health centres could be quite well put in our region, and the other project is cleaning up that electrical mess from the old causeway around the railway station and down to the beginnings of the what I call the old Kingston foreshore. So what do candidates say about those coming up with projects, key projects that can deliver some of those services that people feel they don't have, yet they pay for in the inner south?
Candice, I'll go to you first. Major projects, sort of galvanising big bits of infrastructure or development, are there promises that the Liberals are making for this area?
We will have more to say in the next couple of weeks on major infrastructure and a couple of the other topics that you touched on there. But I do think there's also a lot that needs to be done in the inner south that is more of the minor everyday infrastructure. So again, inner south residents are paying some of the greatest rates in Canberra. Footpaths aren't being maintained. We've got some of the worst street lighting that isn't being upgraded. Residents also often complain about the lack of street sweeping. And so I do think we really do need to invest in making sure that that everyday infrastructure is being taken care of.
And look, we will go to some of that.
Services are being provided.
We will go to some of those maintenance and key facilities questions in just a moment. But Rachel Stephen-Smith, promises from Labor for big, chunky things that will work for the inner south.
Well, we'll have more to say on schools over the next few days, but we've already made commitments, quite significant commitments in the education infrastructure space, and there will be more to say on that. In relation to the health centre, Kevin, you'll be pleased to hear Labor has committed to an inner south walk-in health centre in the next term of government, and so we will consult with the community about what exactly needs to go into that centre, but it will provide a combination of appointment-based and walk-in services with a real focus on prevention, early intervention and supporting people with chronic disease to manage their care better in the community. One of the things our election commitments have been really focused on over the last week is how do we get some of that care out of hospital. We know over the last term of government, we've expanded hospital in the home, we've built more walk-in centres, we've established 2 mobile dental clinics. So we're already on that path to keeping people well in the community where we can possibly do that, and in collaboration with our community partners. So that Inner South Health Centre is a key Labor election commitment, and we'll work with the community to make sure that that meets the needs of the community here in the Inner South, which are going to be very different, for example, from the needs of the community in North Gungahlin or in West Belconnen. And the last thing you touched... Oh, the electrical infrastructure in East Lake. So there's already a plan to remediate that, to remove all of that so that we can get on with the the end of the foreshore and the beginning of the East Lake development. But again, when it comes to East Lake, we'll be working very closely with housing and with the public housing residents there to ensure that they can remain in their community, where we know that those Causeway residents have been there for a really long time, and we absolutely respect that they are part of the community in the Causeway, and that they need to remain if they want to do so.
Shane Rattenbury, just very quickly, time is running out, but can you make some promises for the Inner South?
Yeah, we can. Look, we support a walk-in centre in the Inner South as well. We delivered several during the last term of the Assembly in other parts of the city. They're very successful. They make healthcare a lot easier for the community. We've particularly identified the need to look at the Kingston and Manuka group centres. They have come off the boil in recent years, and we look at the model that's been applied in the city and in Braddon, where investment's gone into putting things like flower beds in, upgrading the footpaths, the lighting, those sort of really basic things that provide the underlying, I guess, zhoosh for a retail centre. And we think those sort of things would make a real difference to getting Kingston and Manuka going again in a way that people would like to see them and bring back some of their former glory.
And look, that's actually a great way to get into the final part of our discussion, and that is the maintenance and renewal of key community amenities, including things like the urban forest and street trees, the open spaces, the parks and reserves. Now, Rachel Stephen-Smith, the Inner South, of course, includes some of the most valuable real estate in the city, close to town, worth a bomb. We talk about a green and livable Inner South, but what about a tidy one with well-lit streets and flat footpaths? We've already heard today about the quality of the footpaths in the Inner South. And what's being done to remedy the suggestion that things are simply not as well maintained as they ought to be?
Well, I think Chris Steele is probably rather sick of my emails to him about the footpaths in the Inner South and the Inner North. But there is a rolling program of upgrades and maintenance, and over this COVID period we built 50 new footpaths as well as upgraded 50 playgrounds as part of our investment in keeping Canberra working through this crisis. But we know that across a lot of our older suburbs, we have a lot of infrastructure that is coming to the end of life, and that's what happens when a city is kind of built at the one time. A lot of infrastructure reaches end of life at the one time as well. And that's happening with our footpaths, it's happening with our street lighting, it's happening with some of our community facilities, and people have already mentioned schools. So there is a rolling program of upgrades and maintenance, and we will look as we continue to invest in jobs, which is an absolute focus through the recovery from COVID-19, as to how we can continue to fast track and invest in those projects.
Peter Swarbrick, do you see that in action? I mean, locally there is concern about the care of green spaces. Tilapia Park perhaps is a particular case in point. Do you agree that the Inner South is being well maintained?
No. I actually live just near Rocky Knob. Beautiful name. And we were very interested to see some that fencing that goes around playgrounds, and we're like, oh, something fantastic's going to happen to our probably 30-year-old plastic tube and swing set. And I was really disappointed about how many people were there, how many days and weeks it was out of action, and all we got was a lick of paint. And in fact, one of the actual sets of one of the metal seats was left unpainted. One of the things that we talk about in the Progressives, Rob Knight, who is the absolute guru on all things urban planning, we talk about tactical urban planning. So if again, it's sort of talking about these things in silos. Let's deal with the footpaths, let's deal with the lighting, let's deal with the green spaces. How about we actually engage the community, because we know that that's good for people, and we actually talk to them about tactically what can we do to maximise what they've got already. For example, there's a pretty tactical bit of urban planning down the road from me in relation to a bike sort of area for kids that's sprung up next to Red Hill Oval. So it's actually sort of homemade BMX bike sort of area, and that is full of people. So these are the sorts of things I don't see happening. I don't see enough of that sort of thinking. I think that just this idea of putting a list of this, that, and the other, and not looking at them holistically as an integrated community is probably why you're seeing things not being done to a standard that people are happy with.
I've also got a question online saying, is there any consideration to manage cyclist access to all roads and footpaths in the area of the Kingston Foreshore and Lake Burley Griffin, as there's no assured separation for walkers, runners, the elderly and children, and there's a mixed age community there? Bruce Payne, I want to go to you quickly. You've called for protecting and maintaining to a higher standard than recently the existing open spaces in and between the suburbs. What do you think is currently wrong?
I think what's currently wrong is that Labor and Greens have got the wrong priorities. Basically, there was a lot of money spent on Light Rail 1. People might be somewhat shocked, I think they should be, that it basically cost about $100,000 for every metre that it was made. So we've basically got that. We've also had our Canberra delivered monthly since the last election to 250,000 households. So we've had that sort of thing rather than, as Peter was saying, maintenance, essential maintenance basically, of footpaths and providing access.
Okay. Candice Birch, the Community Council says that green spaces in the urban forest must be maintained in residential areas. Currently there's a commitment to a 30% canopy cover and a 30% planting area in Canberra's urban footprint by 2045. Is that something that a Liberal government would commit to? Mandatory site coverage, planting area rules?
So the Canberra Liberals have committed to 1 million trees, and we have also committed, we've also got our green space guarantee. So our green space guarantee is about not just preserving green space within a 10-minute walk from your house, but also ensuring that that green space is maintained and enhanced, which is some of the improvements that Peter talked about before as well, making sure that it is actually going to be utilised by our community. In the inner south, we are lucky to still have a lot of green space, but as I'm sure many of you see, it isn't necessarily been maintained, and therefore it isn't particularly well utilised. So we really want to make sure that it's utilised and maintained.
And look, I'll go to your question from the floor in just a moment, but just first to you, Shane Rattenbury. It's only a few years ago that Tilapia Park School had to fight tooth and nail to keep their green space when the Services Club land swap deal fell apart, something with which you were involved. I mean, that was a moderate-sized debacle. Do the Greens prioritise looking after and ensuring access to the parks, the reserves, the community green spaces in this densely settled suburbia?
Absolutely, Genevieve. We intervened to try and to deal with that tilapia situation and got a good outcome there, where we also protected Mocha, which is such an institution in the inner south. As the city does become more compact and more people live in apartments, those open spaces become all the more important. They are essentially people's backyards for many people, and some people do choose to live in apartments and quite like it, but they need those spaces to go to, and we've seen that during COVID, how important and how lucky we've been in Canberra to have those spaces. We've got a really clear plan. One of the things we've talked about, I touched on earlier, is our neighbourhood democracy program, where we want to allocate $100,000 to every suburb each year for the residents to get together and decide what to prioritise that money on, so they can get that real local reflection of what the needs are. It also builds community engagement. It actually gets neighbours talking to each other, thinking through what needs to be done in the suburb and then allocating the money to do that. We think that sort of neighbourhood democracy would really get people getting the outcomes they want.
Okay, and now I've got a couple more questions for other candidates up here, but I'll go to you from the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. I've been disappointed that this has been almost exclusively concerned with what I'd call municipal issues. There are much bigger issues as well, such as education, health, and the state of the budget in the ACT. I'd like to concentrate on just the last of those. I imagine most people here have read John Stanhope's articles in the City News, well-researched, knowledgeable, and quite pointed in their comments. That in his opinion, the finances of this territory have been poorly administered. We're heading for a $7 billion loan situation, which works out at about $17,000 per person, $70,000 per family of four. In the opinion of John Stanhope, who knows a great deal about it, particularly with his co-researchers, we are on a disastrous financial course because of disastrous financial administration pre-COVID. I hope that the respondents won't say it's all due to COVID.
Can I just ask you to pause? No, yes? I'd ask you to pause because we are specifically discussing green spaces, maintenance and those issues. We have a very few minutes left at the end to discuss those huge, big matters that are whole of territory. And there are candidates here who need to have their say on the issues that we've flagged and that we've been discussing with the rest of the panel. So I will go to your question, but I'd like to be able to ask Alvin and Peter, both for their opinions on the matters on urban forest, green spaces and community maintenance. So I'd like to go to that shortly, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Shall I stay here?
Yes, stay there, and I'll get to you as soon as we finish that. Peter Johnson, I want to go to you, please. As in the inner north, the inner south densifies, we've got a greater risk of all kinds of adverse climatic effects, including urban heat islands, the burgeoning climate change effects. What are your thoughts in the context of the conversation we've been having about green spaces, about trees and about community facilities? What does any government need to ensure to mitigate climate change in our urban centres?
Well, what a big question. It's a really massive question. A lot of our policies took that exact question and said, what does this city need to be climate adapted in 30, 40, 50 years' time? We then brought it back to our current situation and what we do with the $6 billion a year of our public purse to invest in that direction while maintain social justice. So I'll pick up three, and it's a really complex question, but I'll emphasise three key elements. The first one is resilience to shocks, and the way climate change will migrate into shocks will not be the way you think. It will be through your purse. The price hikes of materials and supplies that Canberra uses from all over the world, you can expect everything to become a lot more expensive. Secondly, you're going to have very hot summers and very unseasonable weather in the ACT. Our infrastructure isn't ready. We've had massive smoke, we had floods, we had hail, and then we've had COVID, which is partially an issue of disease and human health arising from changing conditions. So what do we want to do? Three things. The first one is the ACT needs to move and evolve into an electric city. We have solar panels, we have wind turbines. This zone between Canberra, Yass and Goulburn is fundamentally valuable, as well as natural storage. So our opposition to what the Greens and Labor have done are this. They've gone off and outsourced multinational companies in South Australia to basically buy their renewable energy off them for a 14-year commitment. We'd like to see all of the solar and wind in our region in a way that we own. And that way we could have really discounted energy costs. Cheap energy and plentiful energy for our city will see our city go forward. That's one thing, renewable energy. The second one is resilience. We'd like to see our food bowl around the ACT. All of you buy materials from around the world and interstate. We make nothing here. Those supply chains close, the price hikes happen, our city is dead. So we need to start innovating now with sustainable industries and materials that we need and bring them up to be world class. The third one is the really obvious issues, okay? Our elderly, our vulnerable will suffer heat stroke and major risk to their health. So in terms of green spaces and the requirement, we certainly support the really strong push by the Liberal Party with 1 million trees, but we would like to see the governance and government get a little bit more out of the space. Shane's talked about 100,000 for each suburb. We're talking about 12 to 15 million for each council. So really ramp up community spending of its own money. Secondly, we'd like to see government get out of the way of maintaining this space. They've done it inefficiently. They don't really know what they're doing. We'd like to see the community councils merge with urban services so that the community controls its urban renewal, its green spaces, and therefore those officials that are managing your street are actually part of your community and accountable to your community every month. The third thing is we need really strong efficiency of the public purse. This wastage, this giving our money into state, this huge wastage of the public purse is going to be the fundamental factor whether we can efficiently use our public funds and adapt for climate change. We need the money, we need the human resources, we need the efficiency, not what we're doing at the moment, which is prisoners.
Peter, thank you. I'm going to cut you off there. We are minutes from the end.
Thank you very much.
And I want to give Alvin Hopper a chance to respond on this issue of green spaces and maintenance of our urban facilities. Alvin, your policies support informal green spaces being preserved. You've talked about the Canberra Nature Park being extended to form a single integrated entity, and you've also called, as have many other people, for massive tree planting. Do you think that the government has been too slow to take responsible action to address the climate crisis?
Deal that we in the ACT can do to affect the climate of the planet. Let's get real. What we can do is protect our own environment. Certainly we need more trees. What we don't need is luxury housing along the shore of Lake Burley-Griffin. We need to have suitable housing for homeless people. I was very critical of Mr. Gentleman I will give him credit. I'm sure he is genuinely concerned about homelessness. But it all comes back to a whole swag of things. I will agree with Rachel on one point when she mentioned the need to recover from our dreadful pandemic, which obviously is overshadowing us at the moment. Our policy is against the extension at the present time, and I stress at this time, and more so because of COVID, of the light rail down to Woden. I believe building a suitable bridge over the lake would be prohibitively expensive. Look, I'm going to make a suggestion. Bear with me. No one else has mentioned this. I don't think any party's mentioned it, but homelessness and other housing problems are a real issue, not just a matter for debate in convenient forums like this. I have here a map of the ACT kindly provided by the Electoral Commission. It's mainly to show the constituencies, but it is a map of the ACT. And what we need, what I'm going to suggest, it's not part of our official policy, but I'm sure my colleagues in CAP would agree with me. We need to seriously look into where in the ACT we can properly build effective housing. I have a few suggestions in mind, but I can't go into them now. Again, at the risk of sounding like the proverbial broken record, we need to have community consultation and proper planning. There is a housing problem in the ACT. We are a small territory hemmed in by New South Wales. We do not want to encroach more than absolutely necessary on our precious bushland, certainly not out to the west. We need to be inventive and resourceful, but it all comes back to the whole question of government. And quite frankly, if I can conclude, I'm reminded, as far as the present government goes, I'm reminded of what Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century is reputed to have said to the House of Commons. He said, "Be gone with you, for you have sat long enough for any good that you may have done." We need a change of government, we need a fresh approach and community involvement.
Thank you, Alvin. That's first. I don't believe I've ever chaired a community debate where Oliver Cromwell has been quoted. So thank you very much. We have 4 minutes left. I would just point out that the parameters for this debate and the heavy focus on planning and development comes out of the Inner South Community Council's analysis of the needs of the Inner South and the survey that they put out across all residents. That's how it's been designed. But I will give you the floor to ask your bigger questions about education, health and other issues within the next 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, my question, I said those are very important, but my question is to do with the budgetary status of the ACT and the articles written by John Stanhope that everybody certainly up there will have read, in which he was scathing in the poor administration of the ACT's finances and the disastrous direction we're heading pre-COVID. Don't let anybody say it's all because of COVID. I would like the representatives of the three major parties to say whether they agree with the general thrust of John Stanhope's articles or whether they disagree and what they think should be done to correct the situation. Thank you.
On the presumption that people have indeed read Mr. Stanhope's articles, Candice?
They would have read, Madam Chair.
But
those
not necessarily. I haven't read them myself, so I'm going to be upfront about that. Candice?
I am familiar with Stanhope's writing on this. You might have also seen that he talks about recent analysis that shows that we were one of the, when it comes to budgetary and financial matters, we were one of the worst prepared of any jurisdiction to deal with a crisis such as COVID. And I think that is very simply a symptom of a government who has been in power for 19 years and who is not respecting you, your priorities or your money.
Okay, Shane Rattenbury.
Every year when you sit down to do the budget, there are far more proposals that are great ones than we can possibly afford. And having sat through Budget Cabinet for a few years, we worked very hard to keep it within the limits. You know, there is a real desire for services, but a desire not to pay for them. This is the challenge for any government. Certainly we need to do a couple of things. One is invest for the future as well. And that debt that John speaks about is actually about investing in the infrastructure this city needs. We've got a lot of ageing infrastructure in Canberra, and we're at a period in time where all the NCDC money that got poured in and all that infrastructure is coming to the end of its life. And we do have to spend some money now. Now's a good time to do it. Money is cheaper than it's ever been. and we have to invest for future generations.
Rachel Stephen-Smith, to you very finally.
I won't repeat everything Shane said, but just to point out that Standard & Poor's did just in the last couple of weeks reconfirm the ACT's AAA credit rating, and the Reserve Bank Governor has been very clear in urging state and territory governments not to pursue a path of austerity, but to continue to maintain services and to invest in infrastructure through this period so that we keep people in work and we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic in better shape. If we don't do that, we'll be worse off.
And ladies and gentlemen, at 5:58, in radio terms, we'd be about to crash the news. So I am going to call a halt to this because our broadcast does stop at 6 o'clock, but I'd like to now invite to the stage the Chair of the Inner South Community Council, Maria Fatsias.
Thank you, Genevieve, for doing a great job. I think a lot of the issues have been canvassed broadly, and I wish all the candidates all the best for your campaigning. I know it's going to be a tough month ahead, but anyway, I think it's we all appreciate the fact that people are prepared to put themselves forward for election. And I'd also like to thank Genevieve for doing a fantastic job hosting our event, and we have some flowers to give to Genevieve, and I'd like to thank Region Media as well for providing us with an opportunity to spread our message more broadly within the community, and also to the Harmony German Club for providing this venue. And we also had a very good team within the Community Council. We had a little working group, and I'd like to thank Sonia, who's our Public Relations Officer, and Kathy Potts, our Secretary, Gary Kent, our Vice Chair, and also, the other volunteers who are here today helping us out. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, everyone, and a reminder that one of the great values of the Facebook Live is that it sits on the website for weeks and weeks. So if you want to interrogate something that's been said tonight, if you want to go back and make sure that you heard it properly, it will be on the Riot Act's Facebook page from now until the election. Thank you all, and good night.